All right, hello. So you are in for a treat today. We have David Barton coming to speak to us. And I'm Dave Riffle, Coordinator of Practical Government, and we've had the pleasure of having Tim and David speak to us all week. That's your incentive for coming to the Practical Government School. And I'd like you to know that David has a website, wallbuilders.com, and on that you'll find that they have a daily radio show. They're connected to social media where you'll find live video daily, and he has a museum in the outskirts of Fort Worth, Texas, that has over 160,000 items, of which 120,000 are from the founding era of America. And many letters signed by presidents, founding presidents, a lock of George Washington's hair. We took a tour. It's a fabulous place. You should go there. And David has a network of over 1,000 legislators with whom he connects regularly to advise them on matters of policy, writing bills, etc. So would you help me welcome David Barton?
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Thank y'all. Thanks, guys. Let me start with a concept. Oops, there we go. Some biblical and historical lessons for today. And I want to start with a passage that comes out of Job 12. In Job 12:7, Scripture says, "Ask the animals and they will teach you." Now, it's interesting to think of what animals are specifically mentioned in the Bible. You can probably go through some in your head right now. A lot of times, even when Jesus talks about animals, we think about the animals. We don't think about the characteristics that go with them or what makes them unique. And I want to do some of that this morning, specifically with the lion. The lion is an animal we see mentioned several times in the Bible. Lions live in what are called prides. That's kind of the family, and each part of the family has their own specific function. The lion we know is the king of beasts. He's the top of the food chain, so to speak. In Africa, he's really afraid of nothing. Everyone else is afraid of him. When he speaks, they all kind of run. And so, interestingly enough, the lions live on savannas, kind of open areas, kind of flat areas. And in those savannas, when a lion roars in those open flats, you can hear the lion roar from 5 miles away. Now, maybe you've had your parents yell at you. Nobody heard that 5 miles away, as loud as they were, maybe a block. But when this guy roars, it's 5 miles away that he can be heard. So what happens is on the savannah, when it comes time for them to hunt, they have a very specific strategy. What will happen is the male lion will get at one end of the savannah, and on the other end will get all the female lions. Now, the male lion is the one that makes all the noise, but he's a lot slower than the others. The female lions are not the ones that make the noise, but they're the more deadly of the lions. And so what happens is when he gets on that savannah, and when everything's in position, he will roar. He will give that loud roar. And when he roars, suddenly everything runs away from the roar. And by running away from the roar, they run directly into the waiting claws of the females on the other end. It's interesting the way that hunt occurs. What you learn out of that is if you are around a lion and you want a safe space, what you have to do is you have to run to the roar. He is much slower than they are. Our tendency is to run away from it, and actually, that's the dangerous place. Running to the roar, as dangerous as it is, because that male lion is still dangerous, but he's not nearly so lethal or so deadly or so quick as the females who are the hunters. Now, if you get close to him, you get in his turf, you're going to have trouble. But running to him is a much safer proposition than running away from him. So this is interesting when you think of the Bible verse that says Satan is as a roaring lion. Don't let the roar scare you and run away from the roar. And a lot of times when we get intimidated, what we should be doing is we should be running toward the roar. When Satan roars like a lion, great. That's like my battle call. I want to be offensive minded and go toward it. Let me see if I can make that point a different way, also out of the Scriptures. Let's go back to the lion for a minute. Why would we run to the roar? Well, there's another verse in the Bible that talks about lions. It says, the righteous are bold as a lion. We're supposed to be the ones doing the roaring. We're supposed to be the ones that others want to back away from us because we have an offensive-minded mentality that's going to move things forward. We too often play defense. We should be playing offense. It's interesting, the way Christians often think of ourselves, we think of ourselves more like sheep in the flock. The problem is, what we've got is, we're told in Proverbs 23:7, that as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. You think like a sheep, you're going to act like a sheep, which means you're going to run from the roar. That's not what we should be doing. We should be running to the roar. So think of ourselves in terms of being offensive-minded. We shouldn't be running away. We should be running to the roar. Let me make that point with a different set of scriptures. As you look in the Bible, we know that we are taught about heaven and hell. We know both exist because the Bible tells us they exist. We know how you get to heaven, and we also know how you get to hell. Hell is a very real place. That's confirmed for us in Revelation 21:8. Scripture says that there's a lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. There is a real hell according to the Bible. Who goes to hell? Well, first part of that verse says, the faithless, the detestable, the murderers, the sexually immoral, the sorcerers, the idolaters, and all liars. That's a bad set of dudes. I mean, those who kill, those who lie, these guys do things that put them in hell. They make their choice of behavior that puts them there. But if you'll notice, there's a blank spot right there, missing a couple of words. The thing that starts out the list, the scriptures, the first group that gets sent to hell, it says, are the cowards and the fearful. Those who have no backbone. Now see, most of the rest of them are there for what they did. Those first two are there for what they didn't do. They didn't have backbone. They didn't stand up. They were fearful. They backed away from the roar. That's the first group that goes. So the scriptural point, again, makes the point, you run to the roar. You get a backbone, you stand up, and you don't back away from certain things. Now, that makes a different mindset because, again, as a man thinks in his heart, so is it. We just got to reprocess the way we do this. Let me take you to another scripture that makes the same point. It's out of Job. In Job chapter 39, what happens in Job 1 through 37, you start with the story of Job, and Job gets whacked, and then he's got his three friends, if you can call them friends, and they're all there together, and they're telling Job that this is your fault. If you hadn't been so wicked, this wouldn't have happened to you. And so in chapter 38, God shows up and essentially says, you guys have no clue what you're talking about. And in chapter 38 on, God starts going through the animals and starts saying, have you never noticed how this animal does this? And I made this animal to do this. And so he's saying, you guys should have had a whole lot better theology just by studying my creation, just by studying the animals I made, just by studying the characteristics I put in them. And as God is going through this list of animals, as it gets over to chapter 39, he talks about the horse. He said, have you paid attention to the way that I made the horse? Let me just read you two verses out of there. It says, or it's actually several verses, kind of condensed to 2 pages here. It says, do you give the horse its strength or clothe its neck with a flowing mane? Do you make it leap like a locust, striking terror with its proud snorting? It paws fiercely, rejoicing in its strength, and charges into the fray. It laughs at fear, afraid of nothing. It does not shy away from the sword. The quiver rattles against its side, along with flashing spear and lance. In frenzied excitement, it eats up the ground. It cannot stand still when the trumpet sounds. At the blast of the trumpet, it snorts, aha! It catches the scent of battle from afar, the shout of commanders and battle cry. So you've got this war horse. God made the war horse, made it with certain characteristics. And if you study world history, you find the war horse has a big role in what happens in the history of nations. For example, you see what happens with the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Jews. Their early artwork features those war horses. You find the same as you go through other civilizations, the Romans, the Greeks, the Babylonians. You can go to the Celts. You can go even into America. The role the horse played in America throughout all of our previous wars, all the way through World War I, it's a big role. But again, go back and look at some of the characteristics that God brought out to Job and his friends. It says, this horse that I've created, it laughs at fear, afraid of nothing. It does not shy away from the sword. Doesn't run from battle. It is, again, it wants to be the one who roars. It wants to be right there in the middle of it. In frenzied excitement, it catches the scent of battle. It cannot stand still when the trumpet sounds. Look at all this offensive-minded stuff that God is putting out, saying the same thing, and it all is essentially, we've got to run to the roar. Now, there's something going on that's very interesting right now that's designed to make us run the other way. It goes with social media. If you've seen what's happening with social media, all the groups that are being deplatformed, all the groups that are being taken down for what they believe, what you find is a number of Christian prayer groups have been deplatformed because that's not the message they're wanting for the nation to hear right now. The same thing with pro-family groups. Matter of fact, even just talking yesterday here at CHARIS'S with Truth and Liberty, they're having trouble being platformed because Google and others are saying, well, this kind of stuff you do, we really don't want on our platforms. So even with Truth and Liberty having trouble with the platform, you have over 70 different pro-life groups that have been taken down. So the pro-life message, that's not something social media wants out there. The same thing with those that would be considered somewhat conservative or traditional constitutional. We think the Constitution's a better deal than socialism. We don't want that voice out there. So all these groups are being deplatformed, and it's very interesting to see what their philosophy is, because what's being left up also says a whole lot. Look at the groups that we have no trouble leaving up. So we don't have any trouble with Antifa or anarchists or so many other groups. That's fine. They've got a message that we will endorse. Now, the big point is, what is this supposed to do for us? It's supposed to say that if you want your voice to be heard, you're going to have to change what you say. You need to back down a little bit. You need to back away from that kind of stuff that we're deplatforming, because if you're saying that, you're just not going to have any voice at all. So if you want to have any voice, you need to catch our message, and you need to conform yourself and just control yourself a little more and kind of tone it down. See, that's the message that's trying to come through. And so what happens, Hebrews 10:38, God says, I have no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. Again, this is backing away. You back away from, no, you run to the roar. I don't have any pleasure in those who are backing away. So what happens is, when all this kind of stuff goes on, when you get wind of a battle, you need to be bold and run to the roar. In the same way, you can't win by letting someone else engage. Someone else needs to fight that battle. No, you need to fight what you can fight. Every soldier in the war is important. You don't say, hey, I'm a soldier, but you're a better soldier than me. You go fight, I'll stay here. No, that's not what happens. Everybody engages when you have a culture war like we have going right now, when things are under attack. This is a stronghold. It's a castle. Maybe that reminds you of a verse. It should. Proverbs 21:22 says that a wise man attacks the city of the mighty and tears down the stronghold. Not much of our thinking today is geared toward attacking strongholds, but that's what a wise man does. A wise man attacks the city of the mighty, tears down the stronghold. He is offensive-minded. He goes in the attack, if you will. Earlier language, he storms the castle. Now, I would not necessarily think that would be a good tactical plan. Yeah, but that's what a wise man does. See, that's the thing. That's a roar. That's a little dangerous. I need to back away. Just in safety, I need to back away. No, that's not the wise thing to do. The wise man attacks the stronghold, and so it all goes to being offensive-minded, or if you will, it goes to running to the roar. Now, when you look at where we are today in culture, as a historian who's gone through so much, where we are right now, we've not been in a place like this for 150 years. This is as much polarized as America's ever been. It is also willing to be violent. We could stand on the verge of a civil war real easily here. A couple things could trigger it, one side or the other. It could get violent in a hurry. Most of us had never thought about that. Most other nations in the world do, by the way. The average nation goes through a violent revolution every generation, and the average nation has a new constitution every 17 years. We're currently 233 years with our Constitution. We've been so stable, we don't think of instability. We're starting to face now things that other nations face all the time. So we're looking at what is potentially a civil war, but we're also looking at fundamentally transforming who we are, what we've had, what's given us stability. You may have seen the stats right now. Statistically speaking, 75% of college students want to get rid of the free market system, go to the socialistic system. And by the way, the guy who is the father of communism, and communism is the most violent form of government in the world in the past 2 centuries, just in the 20th century alone, communism killed 100 million people, just communist leaders that we can identify. Most violent form of government. And the guy who's responsible for that, Karl Marx, in his Das Kapital in 1848 says there's no difference between communism and socialism. Same thing. Socialism is your gateway drug for communism. And once you have socialism, it's just a matter of how you run your government, use a little more force, and you've got communism. So socialism is, if you will, the step toward it's such a close step to communism. But 75% of college students want socialism, 69% of millennials want socialism, and 41% of the nation wants socialism. If we make that fundamental transformation, no nation in history has ever gone from being free market to being socialistic and has survived that you lose your individual freedoms and you lose your national prosperity. So that transition, we're sitting on the verge of that right now. And so with all the climate that's out there, with all the things that are going on, with what we've seen, with all the violence and rioting and what happens with double standards across the nation, we all say we need a revival. And I don't think I've ever heard people say that as much as I'm hearing it right now. We see it across the nation. I've actually been part of prayer meetings in arenas where there'll be 100,000 people who gather on a Saturday just to fast and pray for the nation. Last year alone, there was 50,000 groups that met in civic locations praying for revival. People are saying, we need revival, we're praying for revival. There's a lot going on with that, but here's the question I've got for you. We're praying for revival. Okay, the question is, how do we know when our prayers have been answered and heard? And here's why I say that. Being from Texas a few years ago, we had a serious drought in Texas. We prayed for rain. We prayed and fasted for rain. Governor called a day of prayer for rain. We prayed and we saw the rain come and our drought was over. Okay, when you pray for a revival, how do you know when your prayers have been answered? At what point do you say, oh, we can stop praying now, we've had a revival? What do you look for in an American revival? Well, there's some answers that we can get out of the Scriptures because we know there's a lot of revivals that happen in the Scriptures. You can go to revivals that happen in both the New Testament and the Old Testament. For example, just in the Old Testament alone, you have Asa, Jehoshaphat, and Josiah who had revivals. You have the Scriptures to go with that. But in our case, as America, we also have the Great Awakenings. We've had a number of revivals in our history, so we can even study our own history and see what revivals look like, what they do, how they work, how they come. So you have a number of different revivals. And so when you take the experience that we have with American revivals and combine that with the experience of what you have in biblical revivals, there are some characteristics that stand out. There's six things I want to point out to you. These are the 6 things you look for to know that you've had a revival, or actually, these are the 6 things that you need to do to help a revival occur. These are 6 things that go with every revival, biblical or historical. So, in going through those 6 things, the first thing I want to do is kind of set the tone or set the stage. I want to give you an overall perspective on what this is. And there's 2 things that I want to address, because if we don't address these 2 things, you'll never see a revival occur. What happens with these 2 things? There's areas that I hear Christians talk about, I see them write about, I see it on programs that Christians do, and there's 2 harmful areas going right now. The first is our obsession on a national focus. Now, this is easy to understand because most of us get our news from some national news source. I don't care whether it's Fox or CNN or MSNBC or Newsmax or Epic or whatever it is, but what you get is a steady flow of national news. You've heard nothing about what happened in Yukon, Oklahoma, or what happened in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, or what happened in Jacksboro, Texas. What you hear is a steady flow of national stuff, and so we think at the national level. And as a result of that, when you look at what is going at the national level, take our 3 branches of government. I look at what's happening at the White House. Those 50 executive orders that Biden has issued, they've transformed America in a way that you can't imagine. It's already, they've unleashed the forces to be very hostile toward people of faith that have the beliefs we have on sexuality, on the beliefs we have on life. I mean, those executive orders, and most people never read executive orders, but they're becoming policy and they will be enforced by the cabinet levels. And man, I wish I could change those executive orders. And I look at Congress and what's happening in Congress, and boy, do I wish I could change things there. And I wish I could get the Supreme Court to give us some decisions that I think reflect better a constitutional. And see, I'm well connected in D.C. Tim and I have great connections at White House, and we have great connections in the Senate, and we know justices in the Supreme Court. We can't do anything. And so most people look at what's going on and we get paralyzed as a result because we really can't do anything. See, what happens is we have a national focus because that's where we get our news and that's what we think about. We think about changing the nation. That's not the way it worked. Let me take you back to the American Revolution, the American War for Independence. If I take you through the first 4 battles of that, and those first 4 battles, you look at those first 4 battles, what's interesting is the way they occurred and what happened in those 4 battles. You have top right, the Battle of Lexington. Next, top left is the Battle of North Bridge at Concord. Bottom left is the Battle of the Road to Boston, 19-mile running battle. And the 4th battle is the Battle of Bunker Hill. In those 4 battles of the American Revolution, nobody called the national commander-in-chief and said, George, need your help. We got a battle going on here. Come help us. They never did that. Every one of them acted locally. And what happened at Lexington, they said, hey, this is our community. We'll take care of our community. Same at North Bridge at Concord. All of those were local people saying, we're going to take care of our local area. And so what they all did was they acted locally. Let me go a little more detail. Let me take the Battle of Lexington. 700 British come to Lexington. They're going to confiscate guns, arms, ammunition. 70 Americans from Lexington go out there to meet the British. Those 70 Americans all came from one church. It was Reverend Jonas Clark, who took his church out and said, no, 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 you're not doing this in our community. They went out there, the church went out there to defend the community. 18 Americans were shot that day. They were black and white both. They went to church together. Black patriots like Prince Estabrook, white patriots like John Robinson in church together. 2 hours later, 3 hours later, you have the Battle of North Bridge at Concord. Right there, when the 700 British made it there, the Reverend William Emerson had his church out there with 300 guys and said, no, you're not doing this to our community. And then as the British decided this is not good, we had 70 guys, now we've got 300 guys, we better get back and get reinforcements. They turned and marched back to Boston, the road to Boston, 19 miles. All along the way, there are 4,500 Americans now on the road to Boston, only 700. Where did those 4,500 Americans come from? Well, Reverend Benjamin Balch got his church and went out there to defend the area. Same with Payson Phillips. See, it was the church who stepped up and said, no, you're not going to do this in our community. That's not going to happen here. And then when you get to the Battle of Bunker Hill, you have Reverend Joseph Williams, a battle going on. Oh, here's 2 companies from my church. Let's go over there and fight the battle. See, we were engaging at a local level, and because we engaged at a local level, that's how we won the national victory. We won so many local victories, the Battle of Great Bridge in Norfolk, Virginia, or the Battle of Cowpens, or the Battle of Kings Mountain. Now, George Washington did bring the Continental Army in at times when there wasn't a local group there to do something. We had battles of Monmouth and Brandywine, etc. But so much of the American War for Independence was local communities saying, you're not going to do this in our community, and that led to a national victory. But it wasn't that George Washington took in the national command and fixed everything. It's just not the way it happened. So what happens is you have a local focus. That's what we had from the beginning, and quite frankly, that's the way revivals work as well. Revivals have a local focus. You don't really have national revivals. You have enough going on locally that it becomes national. So let me give examples. The Great Awakening, so we have a number of Great Awakenings. So let's go back to the first Great Awakening. The first Great Awakening, the name that's probably most famous there is George Whitefield. He preached for 34 years in that first Great Awakening. He preached 18,000 sermons in that period of time. And as a result of his preaching, it's estimated that 80% of all Americans physically heard him preach a sermon. Now think of that, 80% of the nation. Well, today I can understand that because you got all of our telecommunications. No, not back then. You got to physically be there to hear that. So what they do? They gather in stadiums with 100,000 stadiums? No, they didn't have that. It's just that he went to that many local towns. This town has 500 people. This town has 7,000. This town has 4,500. He's just going, that's how many towns he went to. That's how people heard him. Revivals occurred in town after town after town after town, and it happens in so many towns. You say, look, a national revival. No, it's a bunch of local revivals that make a national revival. So that's what you have with Whitefield. But there were also other regions. We talk about Whitefield, but Samuel Cooper, what Samuel Cooper did up in the Boston area. I mean, a revival in Boston area, and he's largely behind it. Gilbert Tennant in the Philadelphia area, the valley around Philadelphia, he's the guy there as you go down into the valleys of Virginia, the valleys that are outside in the country, kind of the Blue Ridge Mountain areas. It was folks like Samuel Davies. See, it was all these local revivals that were occurring that produced a national revival. It wasn't a big national thing in the way that we think of it today. So those revivals occur nationally or occur locally. So that's the first thing is we have an obsession with national stuff. We've got to get off the national stuff and look at the local stuff right around us. You remember Jesus in the Great Commission, Jerusalem, then Judea, then Samaria, the uttermost parts there. You start right where you are, and you get it fixed there, then it's a whole lot easier to get it fixed as you go out. The second problem we have is that we think that bigger is better. And this bigger is better thing, we can see it in a lot of different ways. For example, business, Walmart, and all these, Walmart is now finally a bigger employer than the federal government was. Federal government used to be the biggest employer in America. We've now got all these big box stores that are huge. We have the same with education. We have a couple of universities with more than 100,000 students in the universities, a whole bunch that are over 50,000, and somehow having mass production, turn it out, it's going to give us a better education than one-on-one. It's not how Jesus did it. Jesus spent one-on-one time. We used to get a lot better education. Government, it's grown big. It's going to grow big again. Churches are growing big. As a matter of fact, when you look at churches, it's interesting. In America, we have 384,000 churches and senior pastors in America. Now, George Barna, good friend, we do a lot of polling work with Barna. George calls about 500 churches a day. And what he's found out is out of the 384,000 churches we have in America, 72% of those churches do not agree with fundamental Bible teachings. I mean, real simple Bible teachings, like you can't earn your way into heaven, like the Bible is accurate in its teachings, like Jesus lived a sinless life. 72% of pastors and senior pastors say don't agree with those basic teachings from the Bible. What that leaves us with is 107,000 churches that do believe what the Bible says. Now, those 107,000 churches, he calls them theologically conservative churches. They believe the Bible. So 107,000. So he then starts polling those churches, and he says, okay, you're a Bible-believing pastor. You agree with the Bible. You try to teach what the Bible teaches. How do you know if your church is successful? How do you measure success at your church? It's interesting what the top 5 answers are. The number 1 answer for how you measure success is the number of attendees. Number 2 answer is the size of the offerings. Number 3 answer is the square footage that I have in use. Number 4 is the number of programs that I offer. And number 5 is the number of staff that I have employed. Please find me Bible precedents for those 5 standards. See, the problem is you get what you measure. We're not using Bible standards to measure success. We're using the standards that we've just kind of grown up with around us, and we think that's how we measure it. So it's all based on bigger numbers of staff, bigger square footage, bigger offerings. That's how we can tell for success. And if you're not getting that, you're just not a successful church. So what happens as a result, when you look at number of attendees, let me take a couple of examples on that. Let's take a mega church. Take a mega church, let's take a church of 70,000. There's several churches in America that are over 70,000. It's interesting that if I called a pastor out in the country that has 20 people in his congregation, I say, Pastor, we've just chosen you to head a mega church of 70,000 people. What would the instant response be? Success. This is a great opportunity to minister. And see, we see the bigger numbers as a measurement of success. Who's going to turn down going from a church of 20 to a church of 70,000? Nobody is, because that's part of growing. I can reach more people. I can do more stuff. So we think in those terms, and it's interesting that while we're thinking in those terms, statistically speaking, mega churches in America over the last 20 years have exploded. We have massive thousands. There are thousands now of mega churches, and a mega church is defined as a church that has an attendance somewhere over 2,000. So those are mega churches. It's interesting, in the same period of time, the number of Christians in America has plummeted. 20 years ago, 85% of Americans professed to be Christians. Today, it is 65%. So mega churches are growing, but the number of Christians are falling. We're using the wrong measurements, and because we do, we're measuring the wrong stuff, and we keep doing the stuff that gives us better measurements, but it's not the right way to go. If we have revival crusades, we're used to seeing big crusades, and if a church said, I'm going to give $50,000 to sponsor a crusade in India, and we did that, and they only had 5 people show up at the crusade, we said, boy, that was a failure. You don't know that. I spoke to a group one time in Arizona, only 6 people in the meeting. That's a waste of time. No, it wasn't, because one of those guys got called by God, became a senator in the state of Arizona. It's had a dramatic impact on the public policy there. Just one guy in a very small crowd. See, we measure success with the wrong standards. And so what happens is Jesus had the huge crowds. We know there's times when there were 5,000 men that he fed, which means probably 25 to 30,000 in the crowd when you count women and children. So he had big crowds. It isn't the big crowds that changed the world. It was the 12 guys he spent time with that changed the world. See, that's not the measure of how big it was. It was the quality of what you put into it and who you can disciple and who you can get to think differently. That's what changed the world. It wasn't the crowds he had. So when you have crowds, what happens, if you're in a church of 70,000, you're not likely to do a whole lot of activity. Somebody else is going to get that done. If you're in a church of 20, you're more likely to be actively involved, because unless you do it, nobody else is going to get it done. And so what happens is when you have a crowd and when you think in terms of big, we kind of back out of responsibility. We really don't look at it the way we should. Let me talk to you for a moment about what the world looks like in terms of religious demographics. In the world population now is about 7.5 billion. And religious demographics in the world, you have 32% of the world professes to be Christian, 21% professes to be Muslim, 14% Hindus, and 6% Buddhist. Now, that 32% that we have there, Christians are so committed to reaching the world for Jesus Christ that we sink our money into it. We put our money into making sure people know about the gospel, know about Christ. We actually pay professionals to do this. And so we pay people like pastors and missionaries and evangelists. We pay them full time so they can get the gospel out across the world. And as a result of having done this for 2,000 years, we're now at 32%. And I'll point out, at the time of the American founding, Christianity was by far the second religion in the world. Muslims were the highest by a long shot. Now it's reversed. Because of all the work we put into it, Christianity is now the largest religion in the world. However, let me take the concept of the Great Commission, and that is every one of you reach one. He told his disciples, hey, go make disciples of all men. He doesn't tell that to the church. He told that to individual disciples that were gathered around him. That was the last word he gives essentially as he goes back. Acts 1:8 would be probably the last word. But this concept of everyone reach one, let's take this thing of 32% of Christians in the world. Let's say you made it your objective. This year, the only thing you're going to do is you're going to find one person and you're going to focus on them. You're going to get them to know God and disciple them about how to live a biblical life. What does the Bible say about all the issues that are out there? That's the only thing I'm going to do this year is get one person. If Christians did that, at the end of 1 year, we would have 64% of the world being Christian. If we only did that for 2 years, the entire world would be Christian. We've put 2,000 years into this, and if we were to focus on one individual at a time, if all of us just made it our goal to find one individual, just one, we'd double it every year. That's an exponential growth. 2 years, the whole world could be Christian. See, we keep waiting for professionals to do it. We keep waiting for others to do it. We keep waiting for big mass crusades so we can change things. It's individuals that'll make that difference. So that's, again, that concept of crowds. We don't think about what we should do. We think somebody else will do that. I'm just not called to that. Yeah, you are. You're called to disciple of the people. You're called to find an individual and teach them what Jesus taught us. So when you do that, what happens is this is all about acting individually and thinking locally, whether it be the American Revolution or the Bible, whatever. There's lots of examples of this. So going back to revival, so 6 things to go with the revival. The first characteristic of a revival is that you use individual and local action. Just don't get focused on what's going on in the nation. Focus on what's around you and who's around you, and make that what you look at changing. So that's the first thing. The second thing that's characteristic for revival is discipleship. This goes back to the Great Commission. You remember Matthew 28:18-20 is one of the great places that describes that. It's in other Gospels as well. But Jesus said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. Now, it's interesting that back in the 1960s, thereabouts, the church started changing the way we interpreted the Great Commission. What we started doing was look at that as an evangelism mandate. You got to get people saved. And it really goes back even to the 1920s with Billy Sunday, but by the 1960s, this is what we thought the Great Commission meant, was getting people saved. That's not what the Great Commission was about. Remember, what did Jesus say? Jesus says, teach them everything I've taught you. He taught us how to think about economics. He taught us how to think about marriage and sexuality. He taught us how to think about a bunch of areas, and I'll show you some of those in a minute. He says, you need to teach other people everything that I've taught you. It's a whole lot more than evangelism. It's discipleship. And that's why I say, go find one person. Don't just get them to recite the sinner's prayer. And I don't mean this to be derogatory. I can get a parrot to recite the sinner's prayer. Doesn't mean that parrot's saved. It's lifestyle, it's behavior, it's thinking, it's getting a biblical view. That takes a while. That's where discipleship comes in. You have to be able to iron sharpen iron, as the Bible tells us. Sometimes you have to confront and say, you need to really stop that habit because you're not thinking right. Here's the way the Bible says, I've never noticed that before. See, discipleship is all about somebody being able to confront you from time to time, as Jesus did his disciples. He even said, Peter, Satan, get behind me. Hey, I'm not Satan, I'm Peter. Sometimes you got to confront people and say, you're just thinking wrong. And so that's discipleship. Now, interestingly, this is a poll report that came out last week. We've known this for a while. We've seen polls like this 2 to 3 years. Right now, the most unchurched generation in America, the generation that wants nothing to do with the church, are Gen Z. But they're not anti-Jesus or anti-spiritual. They just don't want to go to that place. If it's relational, they're great. See, this is discipleship. The way and millennials are the same way. By polling, millennials is the only group in American history that we have polling information on where each millennial wants to spend time with the boss rather than employees. My generation is all about getting away from the boss, spend time with employees. Millennials want to be mentored. There's something in the heart that says, I need a relationship. And you may be aware that millennials are the most broken generation in American history in terms of coming from a home where there's a mother and a father. Most come out of a broken home, and so they don't have that mentorship. They don't grow up with that kind of mentorship, and that's what they're hungry for. But this is discipleship. We have now 2 generations that are asking to be discipled. I'm not going to that building, but if you'll talk to me, and if you'll help me see this, I'm really open to it. So Gen Z, they're religiously unaffiliated, but they crave spiritual mentoring. This is exactly what discipleship is all about. So when the scripture says, Jesus says, teach them everything I've taught you, it's interesting to see some of the things he taught that we may not teach today, but we ought to be teaching. For example, if I take you to Matthew, in Matthew 19, Jesus says no-fault divorce is a bad deal. Can't do that. The Bible allows fault divorce for about half a dozen reasons, but no fault divorce, since we've had in America since 1968, Jesus said that is bad public policy. That is not right. God said it was wrong way back in Genesis 1 and 2. So we're thinking about marriage laws. On top of that, he gives the definition of marriage. That's real simple stuff. He says, and remember, Peter got upset and said, wait a minute, Jesus, you're telling us we can't get divorced? He said, Moses let us write a bill of divorcement for any reason. We can put away our wife for any reason. Jesus said from the beginning it was not so. Don't you remember that God made them male and female? And that's your genders. He said, and he put them together and said, whatever God has put together, let not man put asunder. So God says, no divorce. I put you together as a male and a female. That's a marriage, and you don't put asunder. So only for cause. So that's a teaching that I have never heard from the pulpit. I've never heard a single sermon on no-fault divorce in all the years I've been in church, and I got more white hair than most of you guys. Never heard a sermon on that. It's clearly in the Bible. It's clearly a long teaching. It's 15 verses long, what Jesus teaches. It's not obscure. It's just that we don't teach that anymore. Same with Luke 19. Jesus has a number of parables. He said, the kingdom of heaven is just like this. And he jumps over to business. Haven't you seen the way businesses do that? That's what the kingdom of heaven is like. And what you find is he says, in the kingdom of heaven, he said, in business, you reward profit makers. Well, today, we're trying to punish profit makers. You make too much money, we got to take it away from you. Jesus said, no. If you make a profit, we want to reward you and let you make more profit. Exactly opposite of the way we think, but Jesus has got economic teachings like that. Matthew 20, another good economic teaching where he voices opposition to minimum wage. He says an employer's money is his to do with as he wants. Government can't tell him how to spend his money or what wage to have an employee. And then he goes on to explain the inviolability of the right of contract between an employer and the individual employee. If I as an employer and you as an employee agree on the wages and we both agree on that, that's the end of the story. Government doesn't get involved and say, that's too much or that's not enough. Jesus is the one who gave that economic teaching. He said, the kingdom of heaven is just like what we do over here in business. And then you've got John 8. This is where we get the right of legal confrontation. In our U.S. Constitution, Article, the 6th Amendment, the right to confront your accusers comes out of John 8:12. Even legal process. So there's so many things Jesus taught about, and that's all part of discipleship, helping people think right about every aspect of life that's around them. And that's what really we're called to do, and that's what a revival is starting to think right. Third thing I'd point to is it's practical. And that's what discipleship is. Look how practical it is. All of these issues that are coming up on the screen, these are all issues that have been raised in the news in the last 24 months. Now, my challenge to you is, as a Christian, can you put Bible verses beside every one of those general topics? You should be able to, because there are specific Bible verses that address every one of them. If you're going to help disciple someone and help them know how to think biblically, can you address issues that are in the news right now and say, see that thing in the headlines? Here's what God says about that. See, it's very practical. That's always what happened in revivals. And by the way, the first 2 revivals happened in America, the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening. The people who led that, like Whitefield and the others, they were largely what were called Calvinistic, not Arminian. Arminian is kind of free choice. Calvinistic is God's sovereign. He ordains it. And so they weren't doing the kind of altar calls like we do today. Their belief was, look, if you're going to get saved, God's going to get you saved. That's his choice. It's not ours. What God wants every one of you to do is live a godly life. So revivals, the first 2 big revivals we had in America were all about how you live. And people would see, man, look how they handle their kids and their business. I wish I could do that. How do you do it? Well, I live by the Bible. Can I do that too? See, it was that people saw what worked, and they wanted that. They saw it in others, and that's what caused revivals in America was they found practical biblical solutions to problems they faced daily in life, and so that's why it's important. And if you don't know stuff like this, I would send you to a book we have called The Founder's Bible, where we take so many of the issues that are in the news and give Bible verses that go with them. But that's something that we should all be able to do to disciple others. The fourth thing that I would point to, and by the way, going back to Jesus for a minute, if you look again at Jesus' teachings, it really is about discipleship. Do you know that Jesus in the Bible only mentions the word church 3 times? But he does mention the word kingdom 141 times. What he did, he's not building the church, he's building the kingdom. And it's how you think. And that's what his discipleship is all about. So that's the third point. The fourth point it deals with the fact that change occurs slowly. People are so frustrated with where America is now, they want a revival so that God will fix everything. That's not how revivals work. Let me take you back to the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening started in about 1730 and ran until 1770. That's 40 years. That's a slow process. Yeah, because when you're dealing with people, they don't change real fast. That's why you have to stay on something for a while, and it takes a while to get changed the way people think and the way they behave. The Second Great Awakening runs from about 1801 to 1878. Some historians say that's the Second and Third Great Awakening. Some just say it's the second. Nonetheless, you're talking 77 years that revival lasted. You could have been born in 1802, died in 1877, been 75 years old, and never knew that your whole life was lived in revival. You didn't know it was revival because it's just what you did every day. But that's how long that revival lasted. If you go to the turn of the century revivals, folks like D.L. Moody and Ira Sankey and so many others, that's from 1880 to 1910, 30 years in that revival. So what happens is revivals tend to span decades. Interestingly, most people in revivals never knew they were in a revival. What was going on, it didn't seem like a revival because it's just another day. And it's interesting that they didn't know they were in a revival, and it's usually historians after the fact who look back and say, that must have been a revival. Did you see what happened for those 40 years? Let's call that the First Great Awakening. Whitefield didn't know he was in revival when it was happening. Most of the people involved didn't know it was a revival. It's historians who later give it that name. So understand the revival, I think we are in one right now, quite frankly. I think, but what you need to understand is revival is a lot of hard work. If you're looking for something that God just sweeps in supernaturally and takes all the problems away, never has happened, never will happen. And that's not a revival, at least historically. God can do anything he wants to, so he can start something brand new that's never been done before. And that's what that kind of revival would be, because historically, this is the way they are. So what you need to understand is historically, a revival is a process, it's not an event. It's not that, man, look at that revival, the nation's different now. No, it happens little by little, line on line, precept on precept, here a little, there a little, just like a little leaven leavens the whole loaf. It's a process of small steps. So that's the fourth, is that change occurs slowly. The fifth I would point to is becoming transgenerational. This concept of transgenerational, it's interesting. In Judges 13, Israel is under the oppression of the Philistines. As you read the scripture there and you read the context, they've been praying to God apparently for decades. God, we need a revival, because what these Philistines are doing, they won't let us worship you the way we want to. We can't have the temple the way it's supposed to be. We can't do sacrifices the way you want. We need out from under the oppression of the Philistines, because they've got everything goofed up in our culture. And so they pray and pray and pray, and in verse 5, God sends an answer. He actually notifies them that he's sending them a revival, because an angel comes to earth and says, Manoah, your wife's going to get pregnant. And when that kid grows up, he's going to be the national deliverer that will get you out from under the Philistines. Time out. I got to wait another 20 years for this kid to grow up before I have a national deliverer? Yeah. But I answered your prayer. But it's 20 years. Yeah. I'm sending you a new generation that will do things differently. It's interesting that when you look at generations right now, polling just from this week's polling, 51% of the nation believes that abortion is wrong. So we've been going at this since 1973. We now have a majority of the nation who believes that abortion is morally wrong. And that's good. Having a majority helps pass things the right direction. However, I will point out that polling this week for millennials and Gen Zers, 80% of that generation thinks that abortion is wrong. Now, how did that generation get 30 points more pro-life than the rest of the people who teach them? They're 30 points more pro-life than their teachers, than their parents, than the culture. How come they're so pro-life? Because God may be sending us a generation that's going to get that right. Now, no question about it, there's still a lot of bad thinking in millennials on so many areas, like marriage and sexuality, everything else. But that's the matter of being discipled. They haven't been discipled yet, but God's already put in them a heart that is inclined to do the right things. They just need some knowledge to go with that, and that's where all of us have to step in and supply that need. So 80% believe it's morally wrong, only 19% support abortion on demand. When these guys get in office, how long do you think Roe v. Wade will last? Not with 80% of them opposing it. This is what we've been praying for. Yeah, it just may take us a little longer than what we wanted. See, God often sends a revival by sending a new generation that thinks right, and right now for us, that's millennials and Gen Zers. Now, in the First Great Awakening, talked about what Whitefield did in the First Great Awakening, talked about other ministers and what they did. It mentioned Samuel Cooper and what he did in Boston. It's interesting, when you study the life of Samuel Cooper, you'll find that as he was doing all of his ministry in Boston, there was a young man that he was pouring himself into. A young man that he kept spending time with, a young man that they would do trips together, kind of like what we would call a vacation. And that young man is a guy named John Quincy Adams. Now, that's pretty significant. He invested in that guy, and that guy is the hellhound of abolition. What he did as a political leader for 70 years is pretty unbelievable, and he was mentored by that guy there, Samuel Cooper. And I mentioned before also Gilbert Tennant. He's the guy in Philadelphia area, and there was also a young man that just hung around him, went to his meetings. He poured himself, invested himself in that young man, spent a lot of time with him. That young man was a guy named Benjamin Rush. Now, Benjamin Rush, back up. Benjamin Rush is, we're told by John Adams, is one of the three most notable founding fathers. He, according to John Adams, you have George Washington, Ben Franklin, Benjamin Rush. We don't even know the guy today. He's the guy who started the abolition movement in America. That's a good reason to know him. He's the guy who started the first Bible Society in America. He's the guy who started the Sunday School movement in America. I mean, he had a major impact on America's spiritual life and its political life. And there was a guy that mentored him and raised him and helped him think right about things. One other example, I used Reverend Samuel Davies. Samuel Davies is considered the greatest pulpit orator in American history. As a pulpit orator in American history, there was a young man that was with him every Sunday and that really hung out with him, and Davies spent time with. And the guy was a guy named Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is considered the greatest political orator we have in American history. And how did he learn it? He learned it from the greatest spiritual order. And it's interesting, if you read Patrick Henry's speech on Give Me Liberty, Give Me Death, Henry quotes Bible verse after Bible verse after Bible. It was a persuasive speech, but it was loaded with Bible phrases because that's what he had learned. So that concept of transgenerational, I've got time to kind of finish this out. John Quincy Adams is the guy I want to focus on for a minute, because John Quincy Adams, who learned from Samuel Cooper, John Quincy Adams, when he was 8 years old, had his musket out with the Massachusetts Minutemen. So already at the age of 8, he was already well drilled in musket drills and soldier, etc. At 10 years old, he actually becomes the secretary to the ambassador to France. His father's the ambassador. He's made the secretary to the ambassador to France. At the age of 14, Congress sent him to the court of Catherine the Great in Russia. 14 years old, official appointment. He is the official translator. He speaks 6 languages at the time, so he's in Russia. Then when he's 16 years old, Congress sends him to help set up the end of the American Revolution, help negotiate the peace treaty. So he sets up all the provisions for that peace thing at the end, 16 years old. So when you look at him, when George Washington becomes president, he's still a diplomat. George Washington, he was 21 years old. He said, John Quincy Adams is the best foreign diplomat we have. He was still a diplomat under his father, President John Adams, second president. Under the third president, Thomas Jefferson, he was a U.S. senator. Under the fourth president, James Madison, he returned back to being foreign diplomat. He negotiated the end of the War of 1812. Under the fifth president, James Monroe, becomes Secretary of State. Then he becomes the sixth president of the United States. After his term as sixth president, he enters into the U.S. Congress. He becomes a congressman. For the next 17 years, he serves in Congress, and he hates slavery. That is what he fought against. He is called the hellhound of abolition. That's one subject he couldn't let go of it. He had his teeth in it and wouldn't back off. And it's interesting, 17 years there in the House. He's an old man. He actually dies in the House of Representatives. But there were freshmen that came in from year to year, and there was a particular freshman that seemed to take a real interest in John Quincy Adams. And so John Quincy Adams, he's willing to pour into that guy, and he helps him think. John Quincy Adams came up with the constitutional amendment to end slavery back in 1843, 20 years before the Civil War. So John Quincy Adams has all this anti-slavery stuff going on. Here's a 3-step plan to end slavery, and this young man just learning at his feet and siding him in his bills and helping promote the stuff that John Quincy Adams is doing. And John Quincy Adams eventually dies in 1848, February of 1848 on the floor of the Senate. This young man is made one of the official, on the pallbearers, the committee of arrangement to take care of John Quincy Adams' funeral. This guy is so connected to him that he becomes part of that. And it's interesting, that guy, it's the only time he ever served in Congress was 2 years. And it was a kid named Abraham Lincoln. And so 15 years later, Abraham Lincoln becomes president, and Abraham Lincoln says, wow, I know. Abraham Lincoln was the young generation of John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams had been the young generation of Samuel Cooper. See how this discipleship thing works? You change one person, you can change the world. And so Abraham Lincoln ends up as being the guy who ends slavery. He puts an end on slavery. John Quincy Adams never saw the end of slavery, but he got to help train the guy who ended slavery. See, that's the transgenerational stuff that goes with the revival. And so the final point I'll make after transgenerational is revival requires hard work. Go back to Whitefield for a minute. Remember that Whitefield preached all those sermons. If he hadn't preached those sermons, there would be no United States. But what he did in his preaching was he had a whole lot of opposition. Nearly all the opposition came from Christians. Pastors would tell their congregations, go get up in the trees over him and pee on him and defecate on him. Hit him with stones, throw cabbage at him. A lot of opposition that came from the church. So church usually opposes revivals in the first years. They get on in the latter years. But the point with Whitefield is those 18,000 sermons he preached, he did not know he was in a revival. That was just, he was not aware of that. And his preaching killed him. Last 2 years of his life, after he would preach, he would go off the side, spit up his guts, he would retch. He'd get back on his horse, go to the next town and preach again. The last 2 years, it was killing him. They actually buried him in a church where he was preaching, and he died. I mean, he didn't know without Whitefield, there is no revival. He wasn't even aware that he was in a revival at the time. He just worked really, really hard to disciple everybody he could and reach everybody he could. And again, it wasn't conversion back then, it was discipleship back then, because he was a Calvinist. God's going to get you saved if you're going to get saved. I need to show you how to live biblically. So those are the 6 characteristics of revival. Hope we can apply those. Remember to run to the roar. God bless you guys.